welcome. I want to thank you today to coming to the Unapologetically Jewish podcast conversation. Today, I've got an amazing, incredible human being on the show. We have Adam Louis-Klein. Adam is a PhD candidate in anthropology at McGill University, has a BA in philosophy from Yale. He knows a couple things. He writes on Jewish peoplehood, anti-Semitism, and anti-Zionism, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Adam, thank you for coming. Fill me in here. Let's just dive right into it, because you've been on the move a lot, but you're moving against anti-Zionism. First and foremost, what is anti-Zionism?
Anti-Zionism is the hatred of Israel. It's really that simple. And I think in naming it that way, we actually see for a second how invisible anti-Zionism is, right? Because if some people tell you, I hate Israel, like I hate everything about Israel, right? How does one usually respond to that? Often we don't have a name for it. We either say, oh, well, some people hate states. Maybe you can hate Russia. Maybe you can hate Iran. Or we say that person is, has a hidden anti-Semitic animus against Jews. But what we don't do is name anti-Zionism as its own bigotry. That anti-Zionism is not rational. It's not a rational political critique of Israeli policy, and it's not a justified emotional reaction to Israel either. It's hatred in the sense that it's a bigotry, and it works through spreading libels. So in the same way that other minority groups are targeted by libels, which is something that doesn't really exist so much in the academy today, with all this talk about racism and racial discrimination of minorities or gender discrimination or LGBTQ, very little do people actually talk about libels, but they used to, right? So the Anti-Defamation League, right? Its name is the Anti-Defamation League. It was formed with the Leo Frank libel in 1915. So Leo Frank was accused of murdering Mary Fagan in Atlanta, Georgia. And how did this happen? Basically, these yellow journalists, these newspapers, were spreading sensationalist news all the time, presuming that Leo Frank was guilty and whipping up mobs into a frenzy, and he was lynched, right? So, and of course, many Black people were lynched by being accused of rape falsely. And so that's actually what we've seen since October 7th, is a kind of endless stream of anti-Zionist libels. So when we talk about anti-Zionism, we have to recognize there are specific anti-Zionist libels. Jews are white settlers, they're committing genocide, they're Jewish supremacists. These are new racialized constructions of Jews based on specific libels, defamatory claims that can't even be refuted because the people who spread them want to believe them. They presume that they are true. And this is really what anti-Zionism is. So it's a bigoted hatred of Israelis, of the Israeli state as well, and of those who are marked as Zionists because they're seen as sort of associated with Israel or sort of metaphorically Israeli.
So one thing that I see that online, especially, or in arguments or debates, or comments, don't say, they're going to accuse you of anti-Zionist. If you're an anti-Zionist, they're going to say you're anti-Semitic, and they're almost dumbing down the word anti-Semitism along with it by saying, I'm going to be anti-Semitic because I'm against Israel. That's one of the biggest challenges I'm finding people are having. And then again, throws us, like we were talking before, on that defensive. So do we still fight against anti-Semitism, or is anti-Zionism just our fight now? Or do we combine the two together? How do we fight? Because we're still using old language of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which has always been there, but now they're using as a term to use against us, against the Israeli state and Israelis.
Right. And, the classic thing, right, is I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist, right? And why does that rhetorical phrase work? It works because anti-Zionism is not stigmatized in the public imagination as a bigotry. So the point is to say, I'm not anti-Semitic, that's bad. I will concede to you that anti-Semitism is bad, but I'm anti-Zionist, and anti-Zionism is noble and virtuous. So some people say, well, we should then try to show that that's fake, right? They really are anti-Semites, right? Whereas I think my position and how Maz looks at it is, well, there's a partial truth, right? They aren't classical anti-Semites a lot of the time. They don't use classically anti-Semitic tropes of depicting Jews as race infiltrators or as behind mass migration, like you see on the right, who are often more classically anti-Semitic, neo-Nazis, etc. They use their own anti-Zionist tropes and libels. So there's a degree of truth that they are not classical anti-Semites and they're anti-Zionists. So it's better to accept that there is some distinction, but then recognize that the problem is that no one is actually saying that anti-Zionism, this form of bigotry, is bad. So should we keep fighting classical anti-Semitism? Absolutely, because classical anti-Semitism hasn't disappeared. There are still people who believe in protocols like Jewish conspiracies. There are also anti-Zionists who are sort of more classically anti-Semitic, inflected anti-Zionists, right? So people who believe that like AIPAC controls America, right? Or they sometimes share these things where you see the different like senators or people in government or power, and they put like an Israeli flag
Yeah.
next to that. In that case, they are sort of using Israel and Zionists sort of in the position of classical anti-Semitic sees, or sort of controlling. You hear Zionist-occupied government, which is actually something that came from the right, and now you hear it a lot on the left. So that is kind of a left-wing anti-Semitism or a classically anti-Semitic inflected anti-Zionism. But we also just have anti-Zionism, right? And anti-Zionism is still the broader frame in which a lot of this stuff is being articulated today. And pure anti-Zionists, let's call them, they only need to say, Israel's a fundamentally, cosmically evil state. It's colonizing, apartheid, genocide. It's inherently evil, and anyone associated with it is evil. Right? They don't have to have this specific theory of Jews controlling the United States. Right? So we should fight both. Moving to anti-Zionism is not saying anti-Semitism doesn't exist anymore. It's saying there's more than one type of Jew hatred, but also recognizing that anti-Zionism is our biggest problem today. It's the dominant form of Jew hatred, and the other forms of Jew hatred are now often embedding themselves in anti-Zionism.
Right. Well, it's funny. I remember when I was younger, I'm older than you are, much older, but when I was younger, I remember being in grade school and someone saying to me, we're talking back in the 80s, are you a Zionist? And I said, no, I'm Jewish, because to me, they were one and the same, right? And we're finding now that this new label of being I'm an anti-Zionist is trying to remove the Jew from that, but it can't remove the Jew from it. So how do people fight that part of it? Like how do we go against that argument of, because that's where we're getting tripped up all the time. People are constantly, and we don't know how to do it, because this whole anti-Zionist thing, many in the Middle East have always been against the Zionist occupation, the Zionist, but they consider that to be the Israeli, the Jew.
Right, exactly. In the Middle East, they're not so concerned with differentiating. So in the Middle East, for example, anti-Judaism, like theological anti-Judaism, classical anti-Semitism, and anti-Zionism, you will see them all together, and they're not so concerned with differentiating them. Now, analytically, we can differentiate. If you look at Osama bin Laden's letter to America, he uses all of them. So you can look at the part where he's like, oh, the Torah is fake, and like Jews don't have any claim to the land, Muslims are the real chosen people. Okay, that's like theological anti-Judaism. Then you can look at the part where he's like, oh, Jews control America, they control the press and the media and the banks. Oh, that's like classical anti-Semitism. And then he's like, there's the part where like Zionists are European colonizers and Israel is a fake state. That's the anti-Zionism. So analytically, they're all there, but they don't feel a need to sort of distinguish themselves. It's really in the West, right, where there's this strong need to say, anti-Zionism, but not anti-Semitism. I'm only an anti-Zionist, because anti-Semitism is taboo in the West. Even classical anti-Semitism is not really taboo in most of the Arab world. But your point about Judaism and Zionism, I personally think I don't understand what Judaism is, what Jewish identity means, without, one, a connection to the land of Israel, two, a notion that Jews are destined to return to the land of Israel, are indigenous to the land of Israel, and three, just basically like Ahavat Yisrael, caring about the Jews who live in the land of Israel. However, it's hard to convince the public that everyone has to have that view, because there are these anti-Zionist Jews, right? So, and they are Jews who are saying that they're Jew, whether it's true or sincere or not, they're saying to people that their Judaism is completely disconnected from Israel, right? So I think it's kind of a losing battle to try and make that argument. And sometimes it's a way of anchoring anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Right. So what we say is anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic because Zionism is Judaism. So anti-Zionism is opposition to Jews as such, and therefore it's anti-Semitic. So it's a way of kind of anchoring it in that discourse instead of recognizing that anti-Zionism is a specific way of constructing Jews as Zionists, as Israelis, and it's not a hatred of the Jews as such, whatever that would mean.
Well, because they argue it's a political movement. It's not like that. That's where a lot of the arguments that I hear of, well, I'm anti-Zionist, I don't believe the Zionist. I think it's a political ideology that we're going against, not the Jewish ideology. and the religions.
Right. So it constructs itself in that way as opposition to an ideology. And in that sense, I actually think it's similar to anti-Judaism in the medieval time, because anti-Judaism said, oh, we're just against Judaism as kind of a belief system. You can convert out of it. We're not against Jews as people. If they become Christians, the same people, but they no longer believe in Judaism, and so they're okay. And it constructs itself in the same way. Of course, it's right, because you get marked as a Zionist, not because, you read all of Herzl's works and he's your favorite author, right? Or you agree with what Jabotinsky once said about like Palestinians being like Native Americans, right? You don't have to agree with that, right? It's just a character, right? So if you have like an Israeli flag in your bio, if you say Am Yisrael Chai, if you do any of that, right, you're a Zionist. Or if you object to anti-Semitism, you're a Zionist. So it's not actually a critique. It's not a critique of a political ideology. It's a way of constructing a certain new stereotype of who the Jew is, really. And it is a politics, of course, but it's a violent racist politics. Like it's a politics in the same way that Nazism is a politics, or communism or Stalinism is a politics,
Yeah.
right? So it's not a legitimate political critique, but it is a hate movement.
So where do we go with trying to educate? I mean, you're doing great with Maz. You're doing great things to educate people and get them understanding where this is. And I think the biggest thing is, again, going back to do people drop anti-Semitism and just make this a fight? We have to fight both sides and have the tools to argue it. So the biggest thing now, the biggest push is fighting against anti-Zionism. What would you say would be the 3 or 4 easiest things for, other than following and reading what you write on Substack and watching your videos and all the things you put out on socials? What can people really do to understand? Because I don't think people, and that's why I want to have you on the show, I don't think people truly understand what anti-Zionism is in our own community. I think that's part of the problem. We don't have the tools. We'll just say, well, that's anti-Zionism. When I would go to rallies and people would walk up to me and I'd be with the police and they say, Matt, you need to talk to the police. What they're saying is anti-Semitic. And I say, well, it's not anti-Semitic. It's rude. It's mean. It's disgusting what they just said, but it's not anti-Semitic. Right. I think the same thing happens when it comes to anti-Zionism, that people don't understand truly what the definition is. And we're talking about that now. But how do we get people to really understand how to use it in, again, I'm not going to say in defense of us, but arguing against it, arguing that we have the tools to engage in this conversation and come out not like we're on defense and not like we're on trial.
Yeah, so anti-Zionism's hatred of Israel, but it's also a specific ideology. And the same with the classical anti-Semitism was a bigotry against Jews. It's also a very specific ideology that people in the 19th and early 20th century came up with, etc., based on European race science or whatever. Anti-Zionism is based on the colonizer, apartheid, and genocide libels. So for anti-Zionism, Israel is an evil state, and Israelis are an evil population because they are white colonizers. They're European settlers who don't have any right to be in the land. Their very presence is evil because they are only there for malevolent reasons to eliminate this indigenous population. So they're inherently racist. So that's the apartheid libel. Zionism is racism, right? And they're Jewish supremacists, right? And they're destined to commit genocide of the Palestinian population, right? And of course, they've been spreading the genocide libel for decades.
Yeah.
And the very concept they use is one of protracted genocide. It's not Israel did this post October 7th. It's Israel is just one long genocide since 1948. Israel's very being, its essence, is genocide and evil, basically.
And that's how they defined it. So I did some research on this. They were using in 2012, 2011, 18 Palestinians died, and therefore, right away, Israel's committing a genocide. It's always been that libel there, that the genocide libel isn't in the moment. It is, as they call it, a 78-year-long genocide.
Right. And everything is fit into those unfalsifiable premises, right? There can't be any counter evidence to those assumptions, and everything just has to be mapped into the narrative. So real things that are happening on the ground can be selectively extracted as like raw material to kind of confirm one's pre-existing assumptions. It's really like a kind of theological dogma that people believe in. And I think when we explain anti-Zionism as the specific ideology, one sees how specific it is, right? And once we see that, once more people in the public see this phenomenon, this whole debate about criticism of Israel versus anti-Semitism or versus anti-Zionism as a bigotry will just kind of disappear, right? Because people will know how to recognize anti-Zionism. But to do that, we need to be able to name it and label it and call it anti-Zionism. We need our Jewish organizations to start talking about anti-Zionism as a real thing and naming the colonizer, apartheid, and genocide
So
libels.
let's go there. So our Jewish organizations, and there are hundreds. I'm a grassroots organization that started, officially back in August, but we've been going back for 2 years now. There are many grassroots who understand this, right? It's the larger, longer, older organizations that we're trying to get, and you're trying to get, talking about this. I don't want you to think why they're not doing it, or how do we get them to do it? How do we get them to start changing that conversation to back up what we're doing, what you're doing, all the work you're doing?
Yeah, so I think there's really obviously a really embedded institutional structure that exists, and that institutional structure is linked to the kind of anti-Semitism discourse that exists, right? You think about the United States Holocaust Museum or what is it called? What was Lipstadt's position, like the special advisor to
Yeah.
the U.S. government on anti-Semitism, right? There's some high level kind of institutional structures that are all based around anti-Semitism discourse and the Holocaust. Basically, the idea was we teach people about the Holocaust and classical anti-Semitism to stop Jew hate emerging again. And as Jews, when we say that's anti-Semitic, as the Specific Speech Act, it's anti-Semitic, we expect that this whole institutional infrastructure will kind of lock into place and just shut it down. Now, of course, none of that has worked whatsoever because what we're facing is primarily anti-Zionism and not anti-Semitism. It has an oblique lineage to classical anti-Semitism in the Holocaust. A lot of it's from the left. A lot of it comes from non-European societies, Islamic Jew hatred, Arab nationalist anti-Zionism. It's a whole different complex. The Soviet Union, right? Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda that's not really coming from what all of these organizations, which have been based on Holocaust memory, are trained to identify. So we're using these frameworks too, like the IRA or the JDA or the Nexus, which are basically ways of trying to accommodate anti-Zionism within the anti-Semitism frame. Basically saying, when does criticism of Israel become anti-Semitism? And presuming that anti-Zionism sort of should be preemptively seen as criticism of Israel. And so these frameworks, these discursive frameworks and these institutional structures are both kind of one thing that's making it hard for us to name and oppose anti-Zionism. So, we hope that with Maz and other grassroots organizations who are seeing this, that eventually there'll be a critical mass and a cultural shift that's already happened on the ground, that then those institutions can update their language and messaging, and so that they can start to have a real effect because they have the power and resources, obviously, the grassroots organizations don't.
Right. So we have to make anti-Zionism part of our conversation and our tools and our vernacular, and then having people understand that and then take it again. And so we have to get that groundswell from the bottom up to the legacy orgs, I'll call them, the older organizations. The challenge I find for a lot of people is, criticism of the Israeli government. Listen, I'm not anti-Canadian because I don't agree with our government. People find that if you criticize the Israeli government, we get called, you criticize Netanyahu, you're going to be called an anti-Zionist now. How do we get through that part of the conversation? Because that's one of the pushbacks we get every time, and I say all the time to people, you can criticize the government. That doesn't make you an anti-Zionist, doesn't make me anti-Canadian of it. How do we get people to differentiate that part?
That's the big problem, right? So there's this abstract principle, right, that you can criticize a government. There's an abstract principle that we should have a democratic society where people can engage in free speech and political critique. However, there's this really existing thing called anti-Zionism, which is an essentializing hatred of Israel and Israelis that's eliminationist, that encourages immense violence and wars, that actually harms Palestinians, right? And that anti-Zionism is not being talked about. So what you have is this play of a principle of critique versus anti-Semitism. And how does anti-Semitism work in that discourse? It's that someone is criticizing Netanyahu, but they have a hidden kind of hatred of Jews as such. And it becomes a very toxic discourse, right? Because someone is let's say they are actually doing anti-Zionism, right? But we misrecognize it as anti-Semitism. We say, you have this hidden hatred of Jews. You don't really hate Netanyahu, or even Israelis, you just hate all Jews. And it creates this accusatory structure, and they do react to that, right? You're accusing me of anti-Semitism. And then they make a counter accusation. You're just doing that to shield criticism of Israel. You're one of
Yes.
these evil Zionists, right? I think we could at least partially or maybe fully get out of that frame if we recognize anti-Zionism, because anti-Zionism, it's often a completely explicit hatred, right? Like it actually isn't often hiding its hatred, right? It really often is like, I despise Israelis, they're evil white settlers, right? But when we need to rest our case on showing it's anti-Semitism, it's roundabout, and it doesn't actually translate what's going on. But on the Netanyahu, one more thing on Netanyahu is that anti-Zionism is a very strange bigotry in that it is directed at a state, and it's directed at leaders of the states. In the UN, we have that thing where all the different UN representatives walked out of Netanyahu's speech, which they obviously did not do for all of the evil dictators that were there or that were themselves, right? So, I mean, that was a kind of public shaming and humiliation and racism that you saw directed against a head of state. You know, at McGill, my university where I'm doing my PhD, they actually did a mock lynching of Netanyahu. So on the Brodek gates, which are the main gates entering the huge green, they literally set up, like, hung a piñata of Netanyahu in prison clothes, bloodied, like being lynched. Right. So it's just impossible for me to look at that and not see that as like violent lynch mob behavior and racism. Right. But no one has even talked about it. Like that. We're in this space of silence. Right. After that happened, no one even knew what to say. There's a kind of traumatic silence about it because it's also difficult to articulate unless we have the language, that there is a kind of distinct bigotry that is anti-Zionist.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking about, like, in the Arab Spring years ago, and even now it's happening in Iran, having them, they did that. They took, like, piñatas of the Ayatollah, and they put them on a noose. But that was their own people doing it.
Yeah, that was their own people doing it. I don't really know how to comment on that,
Yeah.
but it's in the let's say it's in the context of revolutionary violence.
Right.
I mean, you could justify revolutionary violence maybe in some context, but the notion that because something's revolutionary violence, it's not going to involve bigotry, racism, and hatred is obviously very wrong. I mean, look at the Soviet Union and look at how the Soviet Union treated Jews. So the Soviet Union constructed Jews as Zionists, as a political enemy. And Stalin actually did this with many ethnic groups, which he mass deported. He basically constructed them as fifth columns, as political enemies to the state, deported them, and basically destroyed, committed cultural genocide of numerous ethnic groups. So the line between an ethnic group and a political group in actual practice and history is not as clear as people claim.
Right. And so the propaganda we're seeing now is a lot of a repeat, a kind of a rebranding of communist propaganda against Jews.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
And this is that whole, almost that kind of red-green alliance everybody keeps on talking about going towards what the anti-Zionism movement is. So what do we tell people? Again, I really want people to have some takeaways on this because, again, I don't think enough people are armed with the tools to properly argue, because we as a people, as Jews, are such an open wound, and we have been since October 7th, but even prior to that, right? Again, the Holocaust has been such a huge, literally ingrained in our being and right down deep viscerally. So how do we respond without being, I think the best word I'm looking for is, how do we respond more with our head than our heart?
Mm-hmm. I think so. That's our big problem is we haven't unified the head and the heart, or maybe the lips and the heart. Our language and our lived experience, right, are not working together, right? So we have had a traumatic lived experience since October 7th. We've lived under the massive outpouring of anti-Zionist hatred. If you're on Twitter, you see it all the time. They're just comments upon comments of people abusing and harassing you. If you're an outspoken Jew, you get messages of people sending hate speech to you, death threats all the time. We've seen, I don't know, do I need to keep going? Bombings, arsons, murders of Jews that are happening. Right. And the rest of society, this is maybe the most traumatic part, is gaslighting us. Right. Right. The rest of society thinks nothing is happening, except that people were upset about Israel's war in Gaza. But that's also because we haven't had the right language to translate our experience to the rest of the society. We've just said it's anti-Semitic. They haven't understood. So they haven't understood when we said it's anti-Semitic because they're looking at a war. Of course, the images they're getting of this war, much of it is disinformation. It's itself a stream of anti-Zionist libels, but hasn't been named or recognized as such. The kind of media capture by anti-Zionism hasn't been recognized as such and can't be recognized as such until we name anti-Zionism and explain to the public what it is. So the language we're using right now, I don't believe is effectively translating our lived experience to the public. And that's, I think, that will be the crucial kind of thing that we need to do.
So how do we put that together in an elevator pitch? Let's say, because we can't have, you can't sit somebody down and say, well, this is anti-Zionism, and go through a whole, dialogue of it. If we want to get the point across quickly, what would be an elevator pitch to give?
We really need terms like anti-Zionist libel to exist in the public discourse, right? Not blood libel, right? Because when we say blood libel, it's kind of become a way of saying it's anti-Semitic.
Yes.
Right? If I say claiming that Israel's committing genocide is a blood libel, it sounds like it's just saying claiming that Israel committing genocide is anti-Semitic. It's like these ancient tropes that are reappearing, right? When we say anti-Zionist libel, we're saying it's not just ancient tropes, it's contemporary libels in the present, right? We meet them in the contemporary, right? And we don't confuse it with a different libel, right? Because killing Christian children is maybe related to the genocide libel, but it's not the same libel, right? Like it's actually about this is about the Israeli state. It's about Israel in response to anti-Zionist actors and violence, and how Israel responds, and they are spreading anti-Zionist libels. So we need this term anti-Zionist libel. We need colonizer libel, apartheid libel, genocide libel, and maybe ethno-state libel. I see the ethno-state libel as basically the synthesis of the colonizer, apartheid, genocide libels, that Israel is inherently evil because it's a colonial genocidal state.
It's amazing that a country the size of New Jersey is the most evil place in the world. We know we laugh at it. I think a lot of the Jewish community puts these jokes out there and we laugh it off because I don't think there's any other way to deal with it without humor, which is also not the best way to do it. Because again, if we laugh it off or I had a problem during the war, people say, oh, the Hamasniks. So they're not cartoon characters, right? We've got to actually take this head on and make it a serious component. So what would you say to somebody who's having, again, we quickly after the war started, it wasn't long till all of a sudden I was a Zio, which we know is Jew, right? It took probably a year in Toronto for the police to understand that. They actually didn't for over a year understand that. They didn't put the two and two together. They do understand it now. So how do we get that, be that combination of being called a Zio is being called a Jew? They're just trying to hide behind that facade of, again, political Zionism, where I don't hate Jews, I just hate the political Zionist. Again, going back to when I was, a kid, I wasn't a Zionist, I was a Jew because, number one, we got Israel. Israel was there. So what am I, we have the state. Like, what are we fighting for now? So, how do we get that language out there and combine the two that, again, not that we don't want to make it, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but Zio means Jew.
Yeah, we have to explain that Zio and Zionists are ways of constructing Jews as evil in a certain way. It's a stereotype. Right? It's not an opposition to someone's beliefs. It's a stereotype about someone. I have a great example of this because it really struck me the other day. So someone online was it's almost a stereotypic libel. At this point, I call it the Jabotinsky libel. So they find this part in Jabotinsky where he once compared the really existing Zionists, the Jews migrating at the time, to European colonists, and he compared the Palestinians to Native Americans. Of course, if you read further on, he says the Jews are ancestral and to the land and returning to the land. So it doesn't really serve their point. But even if it was, right, it's just this selective fragment they take out of context.
It's like how they use the Talmud.
Yeah, exactly how they use the Talmud. They actually see history, like the history of Zionism, as a kind of text through which they selectively. But anyway, and then I was like, well, I don't really care Sorry. What I said was that's the Jabotinsky libel. And then someone was like, it's a libel when they quote your own words in context. And I just thought that was so funny. He said, your own words. I was like, I'm Jabotinsky now. And I thought that was like the perfect encapsulation of the Zionist, right? Like, I'm Jabotinsky, right? Like, the Zionist is just kind of one figure. Like, Benjamin Netanyahu is the Zionist. Ben-Gvir is the Zionist. Jabotinsky is the Zionist. And anyone they want to mark, any Jew they want to mark, or allies of Jews as the Zionist, is the same kind of imagined figure. So yeah, I think University administrators, governments, they need to understand Zio is a slur. Calling people Zionists is basically a slur at this point. Only Jews really should be allowed to use the term and identify with the term if they want, like the N-word,
So
basically.
I was just thinking that.
Yeah. So that's what I think needs to happen. And that's kind of what understanding anti-Zionism as a bigotry rather than a political opinion is. Because a lot of the discourse, like in the legacy organizations you see sometimes, is that they still think anti-Zionism is just like an opinion about whether a state should exist, right?
And
Rather,
that's a problem.
yes, right. Yeah, right. Rather than a behavior. Of course, this movement is eliminationist. It doesn't believe in Israel's right to exist. It wants to annihilate Israel, but it's a behavior. It's a violent behavior. It's a way of spreading libels, of stigmatizing and excluding people.
That's amazing. And that's the challenge we have, like, again, being called Zios and how quickly it came about. But they also use arguments like when they say, how can I be anti-Semitic? I am a Semite, right? How can you, there are
Well,
three Jewish Zionists because they have Christian Zionists, right?
Right.
So that's that. They try to deflect and say, well, we're not calling you, Jews aren't Zionists because there are Christian Zionists. So how do we argue that back at them? Or what's the ammunition we have for that?
That's part of the problem, I think, with penning it to anti-Semitism, right? Because colloquially, anti-Semitism means a hatred of Jews as Jews, a hatred of all Jews, so it excludes tokens, right? And it's about Jews, right? So if there's Christian Zionists, how can it be anti-Semitic? And that argument sort of works on its face. I mean, they've used that argument in legal cases, like Stand With Us versus Emma. The judge basically swallowed that whole. He said, how can any of this be anti-Semitic if there's anti-Zionist Jews and if there's non-Jewish Zionists? And so the key is really to describe anti-Zionism as its own bigotry, like help people see it instead of just trying to map it on to an existing bigotry, right? Like help people see it as its own bigotry because it's related to anti-Semitism. It's sort of like biphobia and homophobia, right? They're related, they kind of overlap, but they are distinct bigotries,
Okay, it's amazing. So if you were, I don't want to take up your whole morning. I know you're very, very busy. So what I want to give it is 3 big takeaways that people can do coming from this to quickly understand. And we've talked about it a bit over the last, 20 minutes or so, but I really want you to go deep into 3 quick points on how people from listening to this can move forward to combat anti-Zionism at the level we're all at now. We're not going to get to the larger organizations. This is for the people who are watching this now, who need to know, how do I properly use the tools to fight against the anti-Zionist movement?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is name the libels and name them as libels. Don't say blood libel. Call them anti-Zionist libels, right? Name the colonizer libel, apartheid libel, and genocide libel whenever they come up. Talk about anti-Zionist white coding, right? Racializing Jews as white settlers, and object to anti-Zionism. And if you can, when you object to it, when you call it racism, call it a bigotry, don't use the term anti-Semitism because you don't need it. Right? You might think you need it, but you'll actually have more success if you don't. And so I guess the second thing, which is related to that, is flipping the gaze, right? Make anti-Zionism the object. Talk about anti-Zionism. Describe anti-Zionism. And what would be the third one? I guess use slogans like anti-Zionism is a hate movement and say no to anti-Zionism. We need this to be a grassroots activist movement. We have the right to reappropriate that language, right? That took activism, it took kind of academic language, for lack of a better word, woke language, right? And it turned that against Jews. It constructed Jews as the oppressor. But actually, anti-Zionism is oppressive and discriminatory. So we have a right, actually, and we'll probably have more success translating if we can be fluent ourselves in some of this language and learn how to describe anti-Zionism as a system of oppression as well.
I was going to let you go, but you just said something really, really good there. Anti-Zionism is oppression. It's oppressive.
Yeah.
That is huge. Like, I've not heard that so blatantly. Like, that's just like, whoa. So how do let's move on that. Let's go with that. Anti-Zionism is oppressive.
Yeah. So one of the reasons why can't we see that, right? It's because the left has dominated the conversation and it's constructed Zionism as an injustice, right? And thus it's put anyone who associates or is associated by them with Zionism on the defensive, accused, an agent of injustice, and pushed to the right and associated with the right and Trump, etc., right? But the problem is there are left-wing oppressions. Left-wing people tend to think that they can't oppress anyone, right? Because they're very idealistic. They believe they're always fighting for justice. Of course, there have been genocides committed by left-wing revolutionaries, like the Cambodian genocide. They're just countless atrocities committed by left-wing regimes. So obviously people on the left can oppress people believing they're fighting for justice. And the key to how this works, of course, is libel and inversion, right? So Kenneth Marcus wrote this incredible, he's a legal scholar and genocide scholar, like a real genocide scholar, wrote this incredible text called Accusation in a Mirror. And he shows both in genocides, like at Nazis, Serbs, the Rwandan genocide, how false accusations of genocide against a minority are usually actually indicators of genocidal intent, that this mirror logic of projecting your own desire, like violent intentions onto another, often precedes genocides, right? But he also showed that this happened in other cases of persecution. So like I was talking about Black people who were libeled in this Jim Crow era. The number of Black people who were accused of being rapists, while white men were sort of systematically raping Black women, was also an example of accusation in a mirror, AIM, projection. So libel and projection are together working to construct Jews as oppressors, when what is actually happening is that they are oppressing Jews. So they are the majority. They're oppressing a minority by constructing us as oppressors. So that inversion, we have to de-invert it, and we have to invert the inversion and speak the truth back to them instead of assuming their own terms.
So let me ask you this before I let you go. Hopefully you don't say anything outstanding again. I'll keep you longer. How do we deal with this, again, within our own community, where we have what I refer to as a Jew, who starts off a conversation. As a Jew, I hate Israel, right? I am an anti-Zionist as a Jew. How do we have, I truly believe there are some conversations that aren't worth having. I don't think we're going to, the polarized right and left on the extremes. It's almost like they're in a cult-like state and we're not going to get to them. Is it worth having that conversation with them, or even discussing it, or having that debate back and forth? Or are we better off with sadly, because a lot of our media, they're the ones who they go to for conversations. They're the ones who they're platforming to say, it's okay. It's up there with, I'm not a racist, I know a Black person.
Yeah. No, it's a completely illegitimate move. Usually the left understands that tokenism is wrong. But again, I think it hasn't been thematized enough. We haven't pointed enough to historical exemplars, right? Like the Yevsetsia, which was a group of Jewish anti-Zionists in the early period of the Soviet Union who worked to dismantle Hebrew and Jewish life within the Soviet Union. And then later the Soviet Union in the early 80s constructed this thing called AXO, the Anti-Zionist Committee of the Soviet public, where it was in response to international criticism of how Jews were being treated in the Soviet Union. And they got a bunch of Jews to basically promote anti-Zionism and say they hated Israel. And then, of course, in our own age, we have Jewish Voice for Peace and independent
I don't know any
Jewish
Jews
Voice.
actually in that, but okay.
Yeah, it's always kind of a question how many Jews are in it, right? But this element of tokenizing is such a major component of anti-Zionism. But it can't be framed as political view. Like if you just say anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, opposing Zionism means opposing Jews. If that's the argument you make, it's not really going to work, because the tokenist response actually does work. Well, we have Jews who oppose
And that's
Zionism.
part of the problem. We see a lot of people putting those memes out, of those statements out, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. We see that a lot.
Right. And it comes from a reasonable place, right? It comes from, I'm encountering anti-Zionism and it's Jew hate, and I'm suffering from it, and the language I have is anti-Semitism discourse. But I think that it ultimately doesn't translate.
Right. Well, that's because it goes back to our original part of the conversation, that we're fighting the same battle on two different fronts, right? So that's amazing. Listen, you got so many things coming up. Give me where the best places people can find you. I mean, I read your Substack every day, so I know you're there. You see your Maz posts. What are the best ways for people to get educated in what you're doing, other than watching this 1,000 times so they're well versed in what we talked about? What else can people do to learn from you and any others that you think are great assets to making this anti-Zionism movement something of the past?
Yeah, well, they can go to maazaction.com, M-A-A-Z action.org, sorry, maazaction.org. We have a lot of educational materials on there. We talk about all the different libels, talk about the regional variants of anti-Zionism, and help people see anti-Zionism as one thing, which it really is. And then we also have a contact form there where you can get in touch and learn how to get involved. We also have, stickers and posters that people can create and sticker them around town. That's actually really helpful to get that inside of people's consciousness and unconsciousness. And yeah, you can find me on X, and my website is adamlouisklein.com, Louisklein. And that has links to, my writings and stuff.
As many tools as possible, because we showed up on October 8th to a game we didn't know we were playing. And I think we
Exactly.
were late. We dropped into the 8th inning. I think we're in about the 7th now. I think we're scaling the back a bit. But I think
Yeah.
that we showed up to a game that we didn't know was actually happening, and we're late.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's ideas for courses and stuff coming up, but they're not finalized yet. But yeah, I will share that when that happens.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. So, Adam, I want to thank you so much. Stick around afterwards, but I want to really thank you for your time, and I hope we can do it more often as we can get more information out there. Even if it's for short things, blips here, go live on X or on IG. Just if you have an idea, or you want to push something out, I'm happy to do it with you. And again, thank you for your time. And this is such an important conversation, and really giving people the tools to understand what anti-Zionism really is and how we can put it together as anti-Zionist, libel, and really start defining it and having that solid definition. Because I even think we've gotten confused and blurred on the anti-Semitism definition at this point in time. So again, thank you so much for your time. Stick around and talk to you in a little bit, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure.